So I'm Dr. Patrick Hamilton. I teach English up at Misericordia University. I do work in sort of post World War II contemporary American literature and over the last few years more and more popular culture. Particularly in terms of comics and race and superhero comics and things like that. That's sort of where my work has been. And zombies has been sort of a side project. I've generally become sort of more interested in monsters in popular culture. In recent years, I've been teaching, we have like an intro to being an English major class, basically, where they do the point is to like get the skills to learn how to be an English major. And I've built that class around monsters. So last year was Dracula, this year it's Frankenstein, who's at least somewhat zombie adjacent. But yeah, so that's sort of where I come from in terms of my background.
I was going to ask why you're using monsters like you had said, zombies or Dracula or
Mhm.
Frankenstein, and pop culture as like what is the purpose, what is the meaning, and what's the importance like for someone to like really take pop culture seriously and study it? Like what do we get from that?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that I can answer that question. One is that I generally teach the class in the fall, and so in the middle of spooky season, and so monsters seemed kind of appropriate for that. Also, it seemed like a nice kind of hook to get the students interested. The class is one that fulfills a requirement that all students take, so most of the class is non-majors actually. So trying to find a way to get them interested in literature and studying these things and thinking about these things, I thought Monsters was a good hook. In terms of pop culture generally, you've probably heard this from Dr. Austin in the past as well. Popular culture, as much as we generally think of it as just entertainment, and we just sort of consume it somewhat unthinkingly most of the time. Pop culture is always selling us things, and in particular is selling us ideas and how to think about things. And so I'm with Dr. Austin in the regard that I think it's worthwhile to really think about and pay attention to popular culture and what it's doing in terms of issues of race and gender, class, and those topics because it is a way that those ideas sort of get out and get sort of perpetuated throughout the culture. So, as innocent as pop culture might seem, it is something that is, you know, shaping the way that people think about certain issues. I know when Dr. Austin and I taught the comic book class, we always got some comment from a student that was like, "Well, you've ruined comics for me because now I can't look at them without, thinking about these things." So, and zombies and monsters are very much tied into particularly the way that we think about people different from ourselves. Monsters in various ways are a way of framing people that are not ourselves, whether that's, differences in race or gender or sexuality or class. And so monsters I think are particularly important to me since that's a lot of what I focus on. Why do you think zombies have remained sort of popular within sort of, American culture, society?
Well, I don't know about like American culture really, but I know like it probably has a lot to do with like disease and plagues and all that.
Yeah, particularly these days, that's one of the things that zombies have very much evolved to represent. I think most people sort of look at it as stemming from the first 28 Days Later movie, is where you sort of have the idea of the zombie as a symbol of the pandemic and how disease spreads very quickly, and that's one of the more recent sort of iterations of zombies and what they mean, which is another reason why I find zombies fascinating is that what zombies represent has evolved over time. It's proven to be a very flexible metaphor for representing in any number of fears, either within American culture or more generally. And fears of disease, as you mentioned, Owen, is definitely one that, particularly in the 21st century with 28 Days Later and that entire franchise has very much tapped into. But we can go even further back than that. Zombies from their origin have always had sort of a kind of metaphorical aspect to them. They originate in Haiti, associated with Haitian voodoo, but not in the way that people normally think. They originally, if in Haiti, zombies were a figure of someone being possessed and being controlled by someone else. And so they actually originate within the slave population as a way in which they represented how they were being controlled by the slave owners and thus more broadly by capitalism. And so even in those early days, it was very much more of a metaphor to kind of express their sort of position within society. And then, sort of on the flip side of that is how, the way in which that the zombies become the ways in which the disease gets spread. One zombie bites another person and that person becomes a zombie. That then turns the spread of the, in this case, plague, into the fault of the victims of it. That, the victims of the slaves themselves become the reason why there are more slaves rather than, say, the slave owners or capitalism sort of making them into that. And so it's one of the things that's really interesting about where sort of zombies originate is that they've always sort of had this representational quality to them, that they were an expression of how the slaves were being controlled and dominated because they were more a symbol of being controlled and dominated then than we really think of them as today. Today we think of them more, as you said, Owen, as kind of a disease and sort of things like that. What other sort of zombie films, movies, pop culture are you guys familiar with?
The Walking Dead.
That's another classic. That's actually one that I've actually written a bit on. One of the things I find really interesting about Walking Dead is there's a moment in the comic and there's a moment in the show where Rick Grimes is sort of speaking to the survivors with him, and he I think in the original comic it's a double page spread where he just yells, "We are the Walking Dead." And one of the things that I find interesting about Walking Dead is that it's less about the zombies and more about testing the limits of humanity. That the zombies are kind of a crucible for sort of demonstrating the limits of our morality. If you look at Rick over the course of, whether it's the comics or the television show from season 1 to 2 to 3, he becomes much more willing to do horrible things as the series goes along to other people. And the way in which that he kind of turns into sort of a monstrous figure, and the way in which the other survivors kind of have to do monstrous things to survive is one of the things that I find really interesting about The Walking Dead and how it's really, the zombies there are kind of a device to really say something about humanity, and kind of challenge the way that we like to think of ourselves. We like to think of ourselves in that sort of challenge that we would do whatever was necessary. We would do what was necessary to survive, but we would maintain our morality and our ethics as humans. And we see very clearly in The Walking Dead how that doesn't happen. And sort of we start to kind of question about the ways in which we sort of learn the limits of our humanity. And there's lots of moments of that throughout the Walking Dead series. And another way that as you look at sort of zombies over time, you can see the ways in which they evolve. One of the things that's going on right now is zombies are being seen as a metaphor for displaced persons, whether that's the homeless or other sort of individuals that have lost or been removed for their homes. And on the one hand, they express sort of a fear of being overrun by those displaced peoples, but also they've been used to sort of make those people more sympathetic. That we actually end up having sympathy for the zombies as opposed to the humanity that fears them and in fact displaces them. It kind of goes back to how zombies originated in the way that they were much more of a critique of society than sort of expressing things that society was legitimately afraid of.
What would you say about Among Us? That's like one of the new ones with the bacteria or the fungus that takes over and kind of
Oh, you mean
controls.
The Last of Us?
Last of Us, sorry.
Last of Us is really interesting. There the most obvious thing for me is to look at zombies from a kind of environmental or eco-critical perspective, in the sense that a common narrative in sort of environmental fiction is sort of the revenge of nature or the rising up of nature. That mankind for what it does to the environment. There's lots of narratives of where nature is sort of depicted as coming back to get them. And that's very much an element in The Last of Us with the cordyceps virus. very much sort of nature kind of in revolt against us. But also, as I think I've shown kind of the very opening sequence from The Last of Us where it's on like a talk show and you've got two scientists there talking about what they fear the most. And there's the one that says he fears fungi, which number one, I did not need a new thing to fear in my life until I watched that episode. I'm like, oh, okay. So now I got to be afraid of the mushrooms that are growing in my yard. But it also serves the purpose of, besides the revolt of nature, also a common theme in zombies and monsters more generally is the way in which they speak to the limits of what we create or do being in our control. If I remember correctly, the cordyceps virus is something that humankind sort of created or cultivated or is ultimately, was experimenting on and sort of got out. And that sort of, nature escaping mankind's control, is something I think Last of Us is very much tapping into, and you see that in all kinds of popular culture. I always use Jurassic Park as, that example where instead of zombies you have dinosaurs running around. But there's the line from Jeff Goldblum's character, in figuring out whether or not they could bring the dinosaurs back, nobody thought about whether they should. And the resounding answer in Jurassic Park is you should not. And I think Last of Us is doing something similar there in terms of both kind of that revolt of nature narrative, but also that narrative of, the things that we create are not entirely in our control, which again, you see in, monsters, you see that with, I mean, that's the narrative of Frankenstein, at least in part. You can see that in things like the atomic bomb as well, that, we mankind has a habit of creating things without fully thinking through the consequences of creating them. So that's very much what I see sort of going on with The Last of Us, is that revolt of nature slash, science and technology not really being entirely in our control, even as we're the ones creating things.
When you talk about pop culture and the zombies
Mhm.
reflecting like societal fears of the time,
Mhm.
are there any ways that you've seen different series or video games or movies kind of use them to almost like critique society and use zombies almost as like a hero? Like I can think of a couple like different movies where they're not necessarily the bad guys, but
I think one of the, I don't know if this is what you were thinking of, but obviously the sort of classic zombie filmmaker is George Romero. And especially something like Dawn of the Dead, I think works on that in a couple ways. The 1978 Dawn of the Dead, where you both have, it mainly takes place in a mall. You've got like a group of survivors that are in the mall. They're surrounded by a zombie horde. And, on the one hand, the zombies are sort of trying to get into the mall, and they, are very much a metaphor for, kind of mindless consumption, which you see paralleled in the people in the mall. As much as they're gathering things to survive, they're also getting things like fur coats and, just totally superfluous things. And the way in which that, kind of that mindless consumerism isn't just in the zombies, it's in humanity as well. And then the climax of the film, there's a biker gang that's also trying to get in the mall. And when they show up, the climax of the film is them just slaughtering the horde in a way that, as you said, sort of makes us sympathetic for the zombies. That they're just being mowed down by this very unsympathetic biker gang that, is just mindlessly destroying them. And it's done in such a way that you actually do feel the sympathy for the zombie as the innocent victim, which again, going back to their earliest origins, they always were. There's always kind of that sense of the zombie. We think of the zombie as a monster, but the zombie in a lot of ways originated as a victim. And even something like the 28 Days Later franchise, where, it's a plague, people are becoming, the infected through no fault of their own. And so there is very much kind of that layer of victim to zombies that very much sort of makes them sympathetic.
could you talk about the different types of
Mhm.
zombies?
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, I mean, zombies quite literally, have evolved over time, and we tend to think of zombies in particular as devouring brains. That they're sort of going for the brain. That's sort of the classic zombie that's sort of walking around going brains. But originally they were just flesh eaters. That they were, just wanted to consume, human flesh. The brain thing is actually something that comes up much, much later. Obviously, with the 28 days later, you've got the very fast zombies as opposed to slow zombies that we're used to. The zombies that are slow and shambling around are much easier to flee from, even though they're kind of like Jason from Friday the 13th. They always seem to catch up to you. But the fast zombies, I think, also kind of speak to the way that in the 21st century, our fears are increasing. That we seem to feel more threats around us. But yeah, in terms of why the zombies come back, it does sort of vary, according to, whatever the source is. In some cases, it's I think Walking Dead in season one, they actually go through kind of an explanation of how the zombies come back. And it's just that they activate sort of just the most primal aspects of the brain. With something like The Last of Us, they're obviously being more a host for the cordyceps, the mushroom virus. They're almost being kind of more puppeted than anything else. And so there's not even that sort of volition there. But yeah, so zombies have sort of evolved both literally and figuratively over their lifetime.
How about those like Chinese zombies that have the talismans and they're like hopping around?
Oh, those are not ones I'm familiar with. So are
Yeah.
they being controlled by something with that, as you mentioned, like the thing on their head? Is that sort of a means of controlling them?
I think. I'm not
Okay.
really well versed into that, so that's why I asked. What's up?
So yeah, I mean, it sounds like that's going back to the ways in which the zombies sort of originated in the Haitian history that I mentioned as sort of a sign of someone being controlled or dominated by some force outside of themselves.
When it comes to zombies, since it's so diverse and the genre is like
Mhm.
diverse, what would you say are like some of the biggest misconceptions that people like get wrong or what's popular but folks don't know?
There's a couple things that obviously there are certain things that come immediately to mind when we think of the zombie: slow moving, inarticulate, pursuing people for brains. That I think are probably the things most people think of, particularly prior to the zombie renaissance that we've sort of had in the 21st century, where zombie popular culture is sort of back in a lot of ways. All of those are one version of zombies and not necessarily the only one. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is zombies have been used as we've talked about for some ways of criticizing society, pointing out faults in society. There's also ways in which that zombies have been used in ways that I'm less a fan of. One of the things that in my own work on zombies that I wrote on was that back in 2010, 2012, there were the so-called zombie murders that happened in Florida, that there were people that were sort of getting high on bath salts and they were sort of because they were out of their minds on bath salts, were sort of cannibalistic and trying to bite or eat people. And the media very much sort of played it up as that they were zombies. And that was a way of using zombies that I was fairly critical of because it kind of glossed over the ways of what was actually going on. That we were getting, a metaphor for something that was actually pretty intense and horrific and due to very specific causes that got kind of watered down as, oh, they're modern day zombies. And so that's a place where, in terms of what you asked, Jonathan, about, kind of where do people get it wrong? That's an example of where I sort of felt zombies were being used wrongly in the sense that, particularly if you think about, The Walking Dead and what I said earlier about how that very much kind of makes us think about our humanity. The media's use of zombies there, I thought, was making us less likely to think about ourselves and the limits of ourselves.
What should we learn about ourselves and humanity from zombies?
I think there's a few things. I think, in terms of the ways in which, it a concept that gets sort of talked about a lot today is the idea of the post-human, which particular in sort of the environmental context sort of refers to the idea of, no longer thinking of humanity as the center of things, or if you think back to how we used to have the great chain of being that had humanity at the top, animals below them, nature below that. One of the things that the post-human does is get us to think about ourselves not as above or separate from everything else, but on sort of an equal playing field. That, the human, the animal, the environment, we are all sort of part of a system, for lack of a better term, or an Earth might be a better way to talk about it, particularly from the environmental perspective, and kind of thinking about the ways in which that we are part of that globe, part of that Earth, rather than something sort of above it, and how that might change our sense of responsibility for the things around us. I think that's one very recent example of many of the ways in which that the zombie, I think, makes us think about ourselves. Because ultimately the difference between us and the zombie is pretty slim. That we are all, whether it's being spread through a bite, whether it's being spread through, as in the 28 Days Later franchise, blood, we're all just as vulnerable as anyone else. And sort of maybe thinking about how that might change our sense of ourselves in relationship to others, I think is something that the zombie forces us to ponder that we should ponder.
Is there a difference or like a relationship between mummies and zombies?
There's overlap in the sense that both are a form of, the dead coming back. That's probably the main thing that they have in common. The mummy as a threat is somewhat less defined, in terms of what the mummy is trying to do. We know what zombies are trying to do in one way or another. They're trying to consume, humanity, whether it's flesh or brains or what have you, and to propagate themselves. Mummies are more of a diffuse or vague threat. The other thing that they have in common would be examples of what we refer to as the uncanny. That you might have encountered the idea of the uncanny in like a video game or an animated movie that has like a recognizable actor, but he looks a little bit off. There's any number of actors that voice particular characters in video games, and then they use something like that actor's face, but they always look a little bit weird and not quite human. And that's the idea of the uncanny, which comes to us from Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. The zombie and the mummy are also examples of that in terms of, you know, in how they come back to life. They are reminders of our own mortality and thus reminding us of something that we don't really want to think about, which is very much the idea of the uncanny. Freud's definition of the uncanny is that it's, something that we've repressed coming back and reminding ourselves of it. And so zombies and mummies and sort of those any kind of form of the living dead is sort of reminding us of our own mortality in kind of the way it is not like us but also like us.
How about like the use of zombies and like as like minor characters on like video games like Minecraft and like Terraria and all that?
Obviously that zombies have served that purpose as kind of a indistinguishable horde of threats. And so Minecraft and things like that are very much playing into that. I'd also say there's a bit of a danger there in terms of, or a critique to make, that Minecraft is again, taking is something that's taking a group of people and treating them as indistinguishable and disposable. And there's lots of ways that feeds into problematic mindsets that people have, thinking that certain kinds of people are disposable and indistinguishable. So whether or not, none of that I think is intentional on Minecraft's part, but it is something that their use of the zombie is sort of playing into.
My last three questions, like in a speed round. The best zombie movie you've ever seen, your favorite zombie movie you've ever seen, which might be the same, might be different. You can explain why, and then what you hope everyone here and anyone that watches learns about zombies. Like, what do you want them to know about zombies?
Yeah, I would probably, if I had to say my favorite zombie movie, I'd probably go 28 Days Later. I really liked that as a film. I really liked the way that it sort of reinvented the zombie to be about kind of 21st century pandemics and disease and things like that. And the way in which that kind of the actual filmmaking with its very sort of steady or very sort of choppy camera work, kind of like, I don't know what the cinematographic term is, but kind of like Blair Witch, and sort of it's not the steady cam, but it's something else that just gave us a very different kind of zombie movie. That being said, I did not care for the most recent 28 Years Later that came out. I was kind of disappointed in that. I'm hoping that the sequel to that is going to be better. But yeah, I would say that's probably my favorite. In terms of what I would hope people take away from this, it is that, the zombie means more than we typically think it does. That there are a lot of meanings and implications built into the zombie. It can both be threat and victim. It can be the monster, it can be sympathetic, and it also serves numerous critiques of society, whether that's domination of one group by another, whether that's, the ways in which that we're dominated by capitalism, whether that's, our responsibility for, technology and diseases and other threats sort of getting out of control. That the zombie is a very flexible metaphor that can be used for good work to kind of challenge the ways in which we think about ourselves and our place in the world.
Thank you. I appreciate you talking to us, and
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
yeah, thank you. And I'd love to do it again. And I think I'll see you here soon with the Summit History Club kiddos.
Excellent. Yep. Thanks everyone for coming and have a good rest of your Halloween Friday.